Pandemic Hudson North America. This is a smaller version of the game Pandemic, or the classic game Pandemic. Not smaller just physically, which it is though, but it's not a travel version. It's not the same game with exactly the same map, but played on a smaller, in a smaller version. It is a game that is smaller, but also only represents North America. However, the different map is basically the biggest difference here. I'm not gonna go into the details of the gameplay of Pandemic Hudson North America because it is almost exactly the same as the original Pandemic. It doesn't differ from the original Pandemic the way that, say, Fall of Rome or Pandemic Cthulhu did. It is so similar that I'm gonna skip. I'm not gonna tell you it's a cooperative game. You take 4 actions, then you have the outbreaks, etc., etc., etc. You are enough into games that you're watching a video online about games, so I assume you're familiar with the original Pandemic, and so I'll tell you, this is basically the original Pandemic with a different, smaller map and a couple of other twists. So what I'm going to do, instead of covering the general idea of Pandemic, I'll take for granted that you know the game. I'm going to tell about some of those differences, how they impact gameplay, and then my general opinions about the game, because I think you want to hear those. You're not just here to listen to my mellifluous voice, I believe. So, smaller map representing only North America, 4 diseases that we're trying to cure, but already some implications from the smaller map. The rules and game mechanics for movement are exactly the same, but the map doesn't fold around. Doesn't represent a globe. At the same time, it's tight, it's small. You're never too far from anywhere. You're never gonna have to spend 2 turns just moving. That sometimes happened in the original Pandemic, to me, somehow, always. Because that's the way it was. I wanted to save my cards to do something else. And spending a turn or 2 just moving is not all that fun. You're gonna do more than that because it feels tight and pleasantly claustrophobic, given the topic. That is a plus, not a minus. So right there, that's pretty interesting. You still have some bottlenecks like Santo Domingo. It's kind of annoying to go to. On the other hand, an outbreak there is quite not as bad as one in New York. That is, well, understandably, a real disaster. Denver! Who knew that Denver was so well connected? An outbreak in Denver is just as bad as one in New York, so that's fun. Characters. We have 4 characters in this game from all the ones that we have seen from previous editions of Pandemic. We got the journalist, the researcher, the dispatcher, and the medic. Glad for the medic is my daughter Amelia's favorite one. She always wants to play it. I would have been sad if there wasn't one. I prefer like the journalist. So you got some really solid characters here. The dispatcher, usually one of the favorite ones, especially by experienced players, because you can create really interesting synergies by moving characters around. The researcher never hurts. So, not a huge selection, only 4, but good ones. Another interesting element that has to do with the map, and one of the few tweaks from the original Pandemic, is that you have one research center that has already been built there at the beginning of the game in Atlanta, and this is the only place where you can find a cure to your diseases. So when you have 4 cards of the type indicating the disease that you want to cure, you go to Atlanta, spend an action, discard those, and you find a cure for that disease. But there you don't have the action of building out a research center. So again, the menu of options is a little smaller, although that's not an action that you take off the top in the original game, but also traveling from research center to research center. That teleporting option is not there anymore. Other than that, the game is your beloved Pandemic. One thing that certainly was not in the real Pandemic, unless the stress of the quarantine is giving me some massive brain damage and memory loss, the crisis cards, basically event cards, but bad, negative things that you can add to your deck to make your life more impossible, because 2020 has been just so easy, almost to the point of being boring. And just to give you a general sense of what they look like. I'll leave you to discover all the fun that it can bring. Optional cards, you can add them if you are just so bored, tired of winning the standard game. So, Pandemic, Hot Zone North America. Your first thought was like, I don't need this, I already have Pandemic. And in a sense, of course, you don't need it. But suppose that you have been playing Pandemic a lot and you have that feeling that the game is just maybe 15 minutes too long, that you really like the first and the second act, but you wouldn't mind if the third act was a little shorter or maybe not there at all. Because the smaller version is not just one that you can set up more quickly, that doesn't take up as much room on the shelf, that travels with you easily. It is also a shorter version. And guess what? I really, really like it. Pandemic, the full Pandemic experience, or close enough that I can fool myself into feeling that way, that is the full Pandemic experience in 30-45 minutes. Yes, yes, yes. In these times of mental exhaustion due to the quarantine, such a welcome variant, because I just hadn't played the big Pandemic in a long time. I just don't necessarily feel like putting it to the table, put it on the table, setting it up, playing it, and then putting it away. And I always mess up setup in some way. I played maybe 50, 60 times, just the original Pandemic, not the variant, and I always somehow mess up setup. I don't mess it as much with this one. It is just the kind of Pandemic that I need now, that gives me still the Pandemic experience, but in a tighter, quicker version that I can play several times, and that really works. So my conclusions are not really short, they are intense, because if I tell you it's just as good as the original Pandemic, just shorter, well, there's a lot in it to unpack. It, of course, has to do with how you feel about the original Pandemic. This may be its biggest strength to me, or its biggest weakness in case you're not a big fan of the original game. This one is not going to change your mind at all. But if you want a fresh variant of the original game that plays very much like that one, and in times of Pandemic you don't feel like reading long rule books, then you basically already know how to play this game, well, then think of Pandemic Hot Zone North America. Keep it in mind as an option. It's a really fun, intriguing, engaging game, especially for times of mental exhaustion. And since it's a cooperative game that you can also play solitaire in times of quarantine, then you don't have to have anybody around. The game, the box seal obstinately says 2 to 4 players. I don't know why they do that, because the game is perfectly fun and fine as a solitaire game. Also, again, simple enough that you can play it with your family. Perfect for times of Pandemic. Oh, with the irony, the sad, grim irony. And perfect for times of Pandemic even more than its original, bigger, longer brother. Pandemic Hot Zone North America. Short, sweet, great, so fun, and a game that actually is going to hit the table more often than the bigger brother.